¿Y si la historia más antigua que jamás hayamos contado no fuera el principio? ¿Y si solo fuera el último sonido de algo mucho más antiguo? Bajo los desiertos del sur de Irak, donde el aire zumba suavemente con el calor y la arena oculta el color del tiempo, fragmentos de arcilla aún susurran en lenguas olvidadas. Cada marca impresa en la tierra húmeda hace 5000 años tenía como objetivo salvar una verdad. Pero ahora, la verdad duerme bajo capas de ruinas rotas y silencio, esperando a alguien que la escuche. Así que, antes de que te sientas demasiado cómodo, tómate un momento para darle a me gusta a este video y suscribirte. Solo si de verdad disfrutas de las historias que flotan entre el sueño y la historia. Y si aún estás despierto, dime en los comentarios desde donde lo estás escuchando y qué hora es allí. Me gustaría imaginar que este silencio se extiende por todo el mundo. La historia no comienza con un descubrimiento, sino con polvo. A finales del siglo XIX, excavadores británicos y franceses se adentraron en las llanuras cercanas a las actuales Uruk y Ur. Sus palas encontraron arcilla endurecida por cientos de años de olvido. Tablillas sobre tablillas apiladas como la memoria congelada de todo un pueblo. Se llamaban Sumerios. Y desde el momento en que su nombre volvió a pronunciarse en voz alta, algo extraño comenzó a suceder en nuestra cronología. Porque lo que dejaron atrás no fue la escritura insegura de un pueblo recién nacido. Ya era compleja, mesurada y profundamente consciente del universo. Los primeros registros sumerios aparecen como surgidos de la nada alrededor del 3500 a.C. Sin un crecimiento lento que los condujera, su lengua estaba plenamente formada, sus planos urbanos perfectamente alineados, sus mapas espaciales ya eran precisos. Construyeron templos, zigurats, sistemas de riego y sistemas matemáticos que aún forman la base de nuestro calendario actual. Fue como si el telón se hubiera levantado repentinamente sobre un pueblo que comenzó en pleno florecimiento y luego se desvaneció tan extrañamente como había aparecido. Los expertos han luchado durante mucho tiempo para explicar esa rapidez. La historia prefiere el progreso lento, la invención gradual, una herramienta que lleva a la siguiente. Pero los sumerios complicaron ese ritmo. Hablaron de una época anterior a los reyes, anterior a los diluvios, cuando se transmitía el conocimiento. Nombraron a sus maestros como hombres, sino como dioses que descendían del cielo. Y aunque dicho lenguaje se vistió posteriormente de mito, su fundamento parece más antiguo que la metáfora. La arcilla no miente, recuerda. Imagina sostener una de esas tablillas cálidas en la mano, sus marcas en forma de cuña aún conservan el toque de una mano que vivió antes de todos los imperios que conocemos. El sistema de escritura, la cuneiforme, no era solo un alfabeto, sino una forma de significado. Triángulos, líneas y cortes, cada uno dispuesto para contener tanto sonido como símbolo. A través de estas marcas, registraron la medicina, el comercio, los himnos, los contratos e incluso los movimientos de las estrellas. Una tablilla enumera las etapas de Venus con una exactitud que solo confirmamos con telescopios modernos. Otra describe las trayectorias de Júpiter y Marte. Y luego están las historias de Enki y Enlil, de Anu, de la creación moldeada a partir de la tierra y el espíritu divino. Es fácil descartar la mitología como invención, pero cuando el mito repite el mismo patrón a través de los continentes, el silencio entre líneas comienza a vibrar. Los sumerios hablaban de un gran diluvio que puso fin a un mundo anterior. La misma historia se encuentra en textos acádicos, hebreos, hindúes e incluso mesoamericanos. ¿Cómo pudieron culturas separadas por océanos recordar el mismo desastre? Quizás la memoria misma flota como la tierra, asentándose donde la conciencia encuentra espacio. O quizás los antiguos compartieron más de lo que nos permitimos imaginar. Cuando los excavadores descubrieron la ciudad de Uruk, esperaban unos inicios rudimentarios. En cambio, encontraron murallas que se extendían 6 millas, enormes templos alineados con puntos espaciales y evidencia de una metalistería avanzada. Enterrados bajo un zigurat, desenterraron una biblioteca de más de 40.000 tablillas de arcilla, un pueblo que se documentó a sí mismo con asombroso detalle, pero que nos dejó con más preguntas que respuestas. ¿Cómo aprendieron tanto y tan rápido? ¿De dónde salieron sus matemáticas basadas en 60 y no en 10? ¿Por qué cartografiaron los cielos con tanta familiaridad, como si estuvieran recordando en lugar de descubriendo? Algunos investigadores sugieren que Sumeria surgió de siglos de desarrollo olvidado, una línea de pequeños asentamientos perdidos por el desgaste y las inundaciones. Otros susurran que los sumerios recibieron su conocimiento de un pueblo aún más antiguo, borrado por los desastres que pusieron fin a la última glaciación. Y luego están quienes interpretan las tablillas palabra por palabra, que los dioses que descendieron del cielo no eran divinos en el sentido espiritual, sino maestros, viajeros o quizás restos de un pueblo que nos precedió por completo. Pero incluso los escépticos admiten algo extraño. La cronología sumeria no encaja. No se supone que los pueblos parezcan completamente estructurados, pero aquí sí lo eran. Agricultura, escritura, derecho, música, medicina, todo a la vez. Las tablillas de arcilla no muestran ensayo y error. Muestran una mejora como si lo que llamamos el nacimiento de la civilización fuera para ellos una reconstrucción. En el Museo del Antiguo Oriente Próximo de Berlín, un pequeño cilindro de arcilla reposa tras un cristal. Las marcas en su superficie describen la construcción de un templo en honor a Inanna, la diosa del amor y la guerra. Pero entre las líneas de dedicación, una frase destaca, la restauración de lo que era antes. Restauración, una palabra que significa memoria, no invención. Es una confesión silenciosa que incluso los sumerios se consideraban herederos de algo más antiguo. A veces, al observar estos objetos con atención, se notan huellas dactilares impresas en la arcilla antes de que se secara. La huella de un escriba que pudo haber vivido hace 6000 años, un pulso congelado en el barro. Y si recorres esa cresta con la mirada, te das cuenta de que esas manos podrían haber escrito los últimos fragmentos supervivientes de una era borrada por el diluvio, el tiempo o quizás a propósito. El silencio entre esas líneas se siente pesado, como si algo enorme hubiera sido arrebatado. De la misma manera que una nota perdida puede atormentar una canción entera. De la misma manera que un recuerdo perdido flota al borde del sueño. Quizás por eso estas historias aún nos susurran. Nos recuerdan que lo que llamamos historia podría ser solo la parte que sobrevivió al incendio. Por la noche, cuando los museos cierran y las luces se apagan, imagino esas tablillas de arcilla respirando en la oscuridad, cada una con el tenue recuerdo de un mundo que ya no reconocemos. Creemos ser el comienzo de la comprensión. Pero tal vez seamos el último capítulo del recuerdo. Y mientras el viento del desierto pasa sobre las ruinas de Uruk, llevando granos de polvo antiguo a otros 1000 años, casi se puede escuchar la primera línea de nuestra historia olvidada, suave, inacabada, esperando ser escuchada de nuevo. Si los sumerios no fueron los primeros, ¿entonces a quiénes recuerdan? Dijeron que la realeza descendió del cielo. No simbólicamente, no de manera indirecta, sino como una declaración de hecho. Esa única línea tallada en arcilla hace más de 4.000 años todavía tiembla con algo que el lenguaje lucha por contener. Después de que la realeza descendiera del cielo, la realeza estaba en herido. Es el verso inicial de lo que ahora llamamos la Lista de Reyes Sumerios, un registro de gobernantes cuyos reinados se extienden mucho más allá de los límites de la posibilidad humana. En la superficie, se lee como un documento histórico, ciudades, nombres, fechas. Pero a medida que la lista continúa, los números se vuelven imposibles. Un rey gobernó durante 36.000 años, otro durante 28.000, otro durante 43.200. En total, 8 gobernantes gobernaron el mundo antes de que un gran diluvio arrasara la tierra. Solo después de ese diluvio el registro se reduce a algo más humano. Reinados de cientos, luego décadas. Los expertos han intentado durante siglos descifrar el significado de esas cifras imposibles. Eran simbólicas, se referían al espacio, enseñaban una lección o preservaban una época en la que la escala de la vida misma era diferente. Hay algo inquietante en esa pregunta, algo que hace que el aire alrededor de estas tablillas se sienta más pesado. Porque no eran historias ociosas, eran registros comerciales escritos por la misma mano que contaba el grano, las deudas y las ofrendas del templo. Para los sumerios, esta lista era un recuerdo, no un mito. Y esa diferencia lo atormenta todo. Las primeras copias se encontraron en las ruinas de Larsa y Nippur. Cada versión difiere ligeramente, como si se hubiera traducido de un recuerdo que ya se estaba desvaneciendo. Sin embargo, la estructura sigue siendo la misma. 8 reyes antes del diluvio. Sus reinados, medidos en decenas de miles de años, seguidos de un reinicio universal. Luego surgen nuevos reyes. Uruk y Kis, cada uno reclamando su derecho divino, cada uno remontando su rectitud a la era prediluviana. Algunos historiadores argumentan que estos números reflejan ciclos lunares o quizás un calendario simbólico destinado a mostrar autoridad divina. Pero otros, quienes se detienen demasiado en la extraña exactitud de las matemáticas sumerias, observan que los números coinciden con múltiplos de 3600, la unidad sumeria conocida como SAR. Esto no era aleatorio. Era el mismo sistema utilizado para medir órbitas, ciclos estelares y distancias. ¿Por qué se escribiría un registro real en notación espacial? A menos que los propios reyes debieran ser leídos como seres celestiales, gobernantes de eras en lugar de años. La lista de los reyes es uno de esos objetos que parece no existir. Une el mito y la historia con tanta fluidez que los expertos aún discuten sobre a qué lado pertenece. Los nombres de estos antiguos gobernantes, Alulín, Alanjar y Menluanna, no aparecen en ningún otro lugar. Y, sin embargo, las ciudades que gobernaron sí. Eridu, por ejemplo, es real. Considerada por los excavadores como la ciudad más antigua del sur de Mesopotamia. Bajo sus ruinas, encontraron capas y capas de construcción que datan de casi 8.000 años. Templos reconstruidos sobre templos más antiguos, cada uno ligeramente más pequeño que el anterior, como si copiaran el lento paso del tiempo. Los sumerios llamaron a Eridu la primera ciudad. En sus historias, fue fundada por el dios Enki, el guardián del conocimiento, quien moldeó a la humanidad a partir de arcilla. Excavar allí revela evidencia de un complejo sistema de agua, altares rituales y objetos hechos de materiales que no deberían haber existido en esa región. Piedras de montañas lejanas, conchas del Océano Índico, una red comercial o un vestigio de algo más antiguo, quizás ambos. Cuando la lista de los reyes describe el diluvio que puso fin a los reinados de los antiguos reyes, utiliza un lenguaje extrañamente similar al de textos posteriores. Luego, el diluvio arrasó. Sin explicación, sin juicio divino, solo un evento que reinicia el tiempo. Bajo Ur, excavadores de la década de 1920 descubrieron una capa de tierra limpia y vacía de casi 2 metros de espesor. Prueba de una inundación masiva alrededor del 2900 A. Se enterró todo lo que había debajo, sellando una era tras otra. Es tentador interpretar esto como una prueba, aunque la prueba nunca es lo que estas historias realmente ofrecen. Ofrecen sugerencias, sombras, recuerdos. En la quietud de un museo, de pie ante la tablilla de la lista de los reyes, se puede observar cuán cuidadosa es cada marca de cuña. No hay vacilación. ¿Quién la escribió? Creía en la exactitud de cada número. Y, sin embargo, se siente como si el escritor estuviera copiando algo aún más antiguo, algo transmitido de generación en generación que ya no entendía su origen. La extrañeza se profundiza al darse cuenta de que casi todas las culturas antiguas comparten un eco de este mismo orden. Gobernantes divinos, gran inundación, nuevo comienzo. El papiro egipcio de Turín enumera dioses y semidioses que gobernaron antes de los faraones humanos. Los Puranas hindúes describen vastas yugas, eras que duran decenas de miles de años y terminan en inundaciones e incendios. El Chilam Balam maya habla de mundos anteriores destruidos por el agua y el tiempo. Siempre el mismo patrón. Gobierno desde el cielo, caída en el caos, renacimiento mediante un diluvio. Es como si la humanidad recordara el ritmo pero no la melodía. Los detalles cambian, los nombres se transforman. Sin embargo, la estructura permanece, un sueño medio recordado que se repite a través de los continentes. Algunos investigadores como Zechariah Sitchin argumentaron que la lista de los reyes preserva un registro de seres que no fueron completamente humanos. Aquellos que vinieron de las estrellas enseñaron a la humanidad y gobernaron hasta que el diluvio los eliminó. Sus ideas, aunque debatidas, encontraron respuesta porque las preguntas que plantean las tablillas se niegan a morir. Incluso los excavadores tradicionales, aunque rechazan la idea extraterrestre, admiten que el comienzo de la civilización sumeria es extraño, una chispa sin par. Otros ven en la lista un calendario científico oculto. Los largos reinados podrían representar ciclos de procesión o eras cósmicas. Si el reinado de Alulín duró 28.800 años, tal vez marcó una alineación celestial, un ritmo de los cielos copiado en la tierra. Los sumerios a menudo difuminaban los límites entre el cielo y la tierra. Sus dioses eran los planetas mismos, sus mitos el lenguaje de la órbita y la luz. Quizás la lista de reyes era menos un registro de gobierno y más un mapa del orden universal, un registro de un tiempo antes del tiempo. Aún así, su carga emocional no puede ignorarse. Bajo todos los números y teorías, hay tristeza en estas tablillas, una sensación de que algo maravilloso existió alguna vez y que todo lo que vino después fue solo su sombra. Cuando el diluvio arrasó, el viejo mundo murió y la memoria se convirtió en mito. Los sumerios construyeron sus templos como un acto de recuerdo, no de ambición. Estaban reconstruyendo, no comenzando. Casi se puede percibir ese anhelo en sus himnos, canciones a dioses que ya no respondían, oraciones a antepasados convertidos en polvo. La lista de reyes podría haber sido menos un documento de poder que una oración, una forma de aferrarse a un mundo que ya no podían ver, un mundo que tal vez ni ellos mismos comprendían del todo. En una de las líneas supervivientes, después del diluvio, el texto dice simplemente, entonces la realeza volvió a descender del cielo. Como si la historia misma fuera circular, descendiendo y retrocediendo como la marea. Cada época, cada pueblo, cada ascenso y caída, solo otro intento de recordar lo que se perdió la primera vez. Quizás por eso aún buscamos sus huellas en el desierto. No para encontrar respuestas, sino para sentir ese ritmo de nuevo, el pulso lento de un mundo más antiguo que la historia. Si el tiempo comenzó una vez antes, ¿podría volver a comenzar? Hay una especie de asombro silencioso que surge al darse cuenta de cuánto sabían los antiguos sobre el cielo. No como algo confuso, no como una imagen de asombro, sino como un sistema que parecen haber cartografiado ya mucho antes de que existieran los telescopios. Los sumerios no solo miraban hacia arriba. Midieron, registraron y alinearon su mundo según lo que veían. Sus templos se construyeron en la dirección exacta de los caminos espaciales. Sus dioses eran los planetas. Su calendario seguía los complicados ritmos de Venus y Júpiter con una exactitud que solo redescubriríamos miles de años después. Y, de alguna manera, este conocimiento apareció no al final de una larga curva de aprendizaje, sino al principio. Si caminas entre las ruinas de Ur o Nippur y te detienes donde los zigurats se extendían hacia el horizonte, la forma de sus cimientos revela algo extraño. Cada templo importante mira hacia un punto espacial, la salida de una estrella en particular, la línea del solsticio, el lugar donde Venus aparece al amanecer. El gran zigurat de Ur, por ejemplo, está alineado casi perfectamente al norte, con sus esquinas orientadas hacia las direcciones principales. Una proeza de concienciación que implica tanto habilidad matemática como observación del espacio. Sin embargo, estas estructuras se construyeron hace casi 6.000 años, en una época en la que la mayor parte del mundo aún vivía en tribus dispersas. Entre las miles de tablillas desenterradas en Mesopotamia, un pequeño grupo registra algo inesperado, mapas estelares organizados, las llamadas tablillas MUL, APIN, que se cree que datan del periodo babilónico antiguo, pero que conservan conocimiento sumerio mucho más antiguo, enumeran constelaciones, equinoccios, solsticios y las horas de salida y puesta de los planetas. Algunos expertos creen que las observaciones escritas allí podrían remontarse a alrededor del 3000 a.C., posiblemente antes. ¿Cómo podrían conocer el ciclo exacto de Venus, 584,92 días, con un margen de error de menos de un día? La ciencia moderna, con todos sus instrumentos, calcula la precesión del equinoccio en aproximadamente 1 grado cada 72 años. Pero en la antigua Sumeria, los escritos ya muestran una comprensión de este lento desplazamiento de las estrellas. Para medirlo, se necesitarían siglos de observación continua o recibir registros de un pueblo que ya los hubiera observado. Los sumerios no nos dejaron telescopios ni explicaciones formales, solo mitos, pero sus mitos hablan en el lenguaje de los datos. Se decía que la diosa Inanna, asociada con Venus, descendía al inframundo y ascendía de nuevo. Su historia copiaba la desaparición y reaparición del planeta en el cielo. El dios Nanna, la luna, era el guardián de los ciclos, su templo, el gran observatorio de Ur. Los 7 grandes dioses correspondían a los 7 planetas clásicos. Incluso el término Anunnaki, a menudo traducido como aquellos que vinieron del cielo a la tierra, conlleva un doble significado. Seres mitológicos, sí, pero también los contados de Anu, una frase que en sumerio también significa los cuerpos celestes numerados. Es tentador leer demasiado en la coincidencia. Sin embargo, la constancia de estos patrones a lo largo de las ciudades y las eras sugiere un propósito, no un accidente. Cada templo, cada ritual, cada fecha de festival mostraba el giro de los cielos. No separaban la religión de la ciencia ni el mito de la observación. Para ellos, el universo era un sistema único que respiraba, su movimiento sagrado, sus números divinos. ¿Pero dónde comenzó esta conciencia? ¿Realmente un pueblo que acababa de salir de la edad de piedra desarrolló solo una ciencia espacial tan refinada? En 1899, el excavador alemán Hugo Winkler descubrió tablillas en Bogaskoy, en Anatolia, textos que vinculaban la ley estelar sumeria con los hititas y caldeos posteriores. Lo sorprendente es la continuidad, las mismas constelaciones, los mismos patrones de adoración planetaria transmitidos durante miles de años sin apenas cambios. Tal exactitud no suele sobrevivir a la tradición oral. Sobrevive a través de registros escritos o sistemas de instrucción preservados. Esto significa que los sumerios no estaban inventando la astronomía. Estaban documentando algo ya conocido. En una tablilla de la biblioteca de Nínive, ahora conservada en el Museo Británico, un escriba había dibujado cuidadosamente la trayectoria de Júpiter en el cielo nocturno utilizando un complejo sistema matemático que los científicos espaciales modernos reconocieron como una forma básica de cálculo. Otra tablilla describe la sombra de la Tierra sobre la Luna durante un eclipse, señalando que el dios es devorado pero regresa. Bajo la poesía se esconde el reconocimiento de la órbita y la forma. Y cuando estos mismos escribas se referían a los cielos como las tablillas del destino, no estaban siendo poéticos. Expresaban la verdadera verdad de su visión del mundo, las estrellas registraban el destino. Hay algo casi aterrador en eso. Un pueblo nacido en chozas de barro y caña, cuyos agricultores dependían de las inundaciones de los ríos, escribían sobre la exactitud matemática del universo como si ya lo dominaran. Y quizás en cierto sentido lo hacían. Algunos investigadores ven en su sistema de numeración basado en el 60 un reflejo de las 12 constelaciones principales del zodiaco, la división del cielo que aún utilizamos. Otros señalan el enfoque sumerio en el número 60, presente en todas sus mediciones, como prueba de la codificación espacial, 60 minutos, 60 segundos, 360 grados. Incluso nuestros relojes modernos aún reflejan su diseño. El ritmo mismo de nuestra medición del tiempo proviene del suyo. Y luego están las historias que inquietan incluso a los expertos más rigurosos. En una serie de tablillas de Sippar, el dios Enki instruye a la humanidad en las medidas de los cielos, enseñándoles a construir instrumentos para ver lo invisible. Otra pieza describe una cámara de vidrio que agranda los ojos. Algunos lo interpretan como una metáfora, otros como tecnología perdida, un recuerdo poético de lentes o telescopios primitivos. De hecho, se han encontrado pequeñas lentes de cristal de roca en yacimientos mesopotámicos, aunque su propósito sigue siendo objeto de debate. ¿Eran adornos o herramientas de observación? Cuanto más leemos, más difícil resulta distinguir su sistema de creencias del nuestro. Los sumerios no se limitaban a observar el cielo. Creían que estaba vivo. Cada planeta tenía una voluntad, una personalidad, una órbita que copiaba el orden moral. El movimiento de las estrellas no era mecánico, sino espiritual. Sin embargo, sus registros se mantienen matemáticamente estables. De alguna manera, lograron integrar mito y medición sin conflicto. Quizás eso es lo que los tiempos modernos perdieron, la capacidad de ver la exactitud y la maravilla como una sola cosa. Si pudiéramos preguntarle a un sacerdote sumerio, científico espacial, cómo sabía lo que sabía, simplemente diría que le fue dado. Y tal vez no se referiría a dioses de carne o fuego, sino al universo mismo, algo recibido mediante la observación, el ritual, la paciencia y la memoria. Sin embargo, incluso esa explicación deja algo sin mencionar, porque su conocimiento parece demasiado vasto para su entorno, demasiado cuidadoso para la mera casualidad. ¿Era este el remanente de una era olvidada, un regalo de quienes ya habían cartografiado los cielos antes del diluvio? ¿O es simplemente una prueba de que la brillantez de la humanidad siempre ha sido más antigua de lo que imaginamos? Sea como sea, cuando el sol se pone sobre las ruinas de Ur y las primeras estrellas brillan sobre el desierto, es fácil creer que los sumerios aún observan. Su forma permanece, tallada en la tierra. Los ángulos de sus templos aún captan la luz de las mismas estrellas que una vez registraron. Sus mitos aún se mueven al ritmo de las órbitas planetarias. Y en algún lugar de ese ritmo yace el recuerdo de una época en la que la ciencia y la divinidad eran el mismo lenguaje. Los dioses que midieron los cielos pudieron haber sido solo hombres. O tal vez los hombres que observaron los cielos se convirtieron en dioses en el acto de medir. Si recibieron su conocimiento, ¿de quién? Entre los cimientos rotos de la antigua Sumeria, entre trozos de ladrillo y arcilla cocida, los excavadores han encontrado algo silenciosamente asombroso. Prueba de una tecnología que no debería existir en los albores de la civilización. Herramientas de bronce que aparecen antes de la edad de bronce. Perforaciones perfectamente talladas en piedra de diorita. Tablillas de arcilla que describían complejas mezclas de minerales y metales. Incluso la palabra que usaban para referirse al conocimiento, yo, no significaba aprendizaje tal como lo entendemos hoy. Significaba algo más cercano a códigos, fórmulas o leyes básicas del orden. Para los sumerios, la ciencia no era invención. Era memoria. Cuando las excavaciones en Eridu y Ur descubrieron tablillas que detallaban la construcción de zigurats, los investigadores esperaban planos tempranos, bocetos de estructuras de barro y caña. En cambio, encontraron medidas, proporciones equilibradas y ángulos descritos en matemáticas de base 60, el mismo sistema que aún usamos para medir círculos y el tiempo. Sus constructores calcularon volúmenes, pendientes y distribución de pesos con una exactitud asombrosa, lo que sugiere una comprensión práctica de la forma cientos de años antes de que los griegos le dieran nombre. Es como si hubieran recibido un manual de ingeniería de una fuente desaparecida, uno que podían seguir, pero que tal vez ya no podían explicar por completo. Incluso en la vida cotidiana, su conocimiento científico estaba presente en todo. Los agricultores registraban las fases lunares para predecir los ciclos de riego. Los médicos enumeraban síntomas y tratamientos en tablillas que parecían medicina primitiva. Una tablilla de Nippur enumera más de 200 plantas curativas ordenadas por función. Otra describe la mezcla de azufre, cobre y aceite para crear compuestos utilizados en rituales de limpieza, fórmulas que recuerdan a la química primitiva. Incluso se menciona algo llamado nigar, traducido como el líquido brillante, que algunos creen que se refiere al mercurio destilado, aunque tal material no debería haberse conocido en esa época. Estos ecos de ciencia olvidada se hacen más fuertes cuanto más se profundiza. Tomemos como ejemplo la metalurgia. Hacia el 3000 a.C., los sumerios fundían cobre y experimentaban con aleaciones. Sin embargo, en las ruinas de Tal Asmarikis, los metalúrgicos han encontrado rastros de bronce endurecido anteriores a esta cronología. Un metal que sugiere una comprensión más temprana y avanzada de la fundición. En la misma región, los sellos cilíndricos muestran sierras, taladros y fuelles. No es una prueba de las máquinas tal como las conocemos, pero significa que su artesanía alcanzó un nivel de habilidad inexplicable por las herramientas que los excavadores han recuperado. Luego está la matemática misma, el lenguaje de su mundo. El sistema de base 60 que usaban permitía fracciones, divisiones espaciales y cálculos de tiempo mucho más allá de las necesidades de la agricultura simple. Dividir el cielo en 360 grados, medir una hora en 60 minutos, no exige imaginación, sino historia. Algunos historiadores argumentan que su sistema debió de desarrollarse a partir de una larga observación, quizás durante miles de años. Otros susurran que tal exactitud llegó ya hecha, el remanente de una era anterior. Algunos expertos han ido aún más lejos. En la década de 1920, el experto George Ruiz sugirió que el vocabulario técnico sumerio contenía préstamos de una lengua desconocida no semítica, vestigios de una lista de palabras científicas muerta. Lo llamó el sustrato de la invención. No sabemos quién lo hablaba, solo que sus restos sobreviven como fósiles enterrados en el lenguaje sumerio. Quizás esas palabras pertenezcan al mismo pueblo que los sumerios afirman recordar, aquel antes del diluvio. Para oídos modernos, esto suena a inventar mitos, pero los mitos tienen la extraña costumbre de preservar la verdad técnica en forma simbólica. Consideremos al dios Enki, señor de las aguas profundas y guardián de la sabiduría. En el mito de Enki e Inanna, él envía el yo de la civilización, una serie de tablillas que contienen los códigos de la música, la construcción, la ley y la artesanía. Cada yo es un principio, una fórmula. Cuando Inanna las lleva a su ciudad, la civilización misma despierta. La historia es espiritual, pero también extrañamente textual. Describe la transmisión del conocimiento como si fuera de una fuente más antigua a una más reciente. Los dioses no son inventores. Son guardianes. Esa palabra, guardián, puede ser la clave. Los sumerios nunca reclamaron la propiedad de sus ciencias. Se describían a sí mismos como receptores, administradores de dones del cielo. Sus escribas aprendieron la ciencia de la forma y el espacio no como logros humanos, sino como un don divino. Y en sus rituales, enseñar o hablar conocimiento era rehacer la creación misma. Un recordatorio de que la sabiduría debe conservarse, no inventarse. Podríamos sentirnos tentados a ver su ciencia como una brillantez accidental, una coincidencia de agricultores astutos y sacerdotes observadores. Sin embargo, hay detalles que se resisten a la simplicidad. En 1936, Unos excavadores desenterraron una tablilla de arcilla de Sippar que contenía una lista de problemas de formas que incluía el cálculo de un triángulo rectángulo utilizando lo que más tarde se conocería como el teorema de Pitágoras. Estos no son los titubeos de una mente principiante. Son los restos de un sistema ya mejorado. Incluso su arte esconde secretos matemáticos. Los tamaños de sus estatuas a menudo seguían proporciones armónicas, los mismos sistemas equilibrados que luego se celebraron en la escultura griega clásica. Los templos de Uruk y Eridu están construidos en escalas de 3-4-5, la forma más simple de proporción de ángulos rectos. Es como si comprendieran que la belleza, la estructura y el sonido eran manifestaciones del mismo patrón universal. El eco se extendió más allá de Mesopotamia. Alrededor de los mismos siglos, al otro lado del mar, los constructores de los primeros templos de Egipto usaban medidas similares. En el Valle del Indo, los planos urbanos seguían cuadrículas de formas estrictas. En cada región, la etapa más temprana de la civilización no parece tosca, sino meticulosa, como si respondiera a una memoria que trascendía la geografía. Los expertos llaman a esto el problema de la sincronización, la improbable coincidencia de un diseño urbano complejo alrededor del año 3000 a.C. ¿Por qué la humanidad comenzó a construir con conciencia matemática de golpe? ¿Por qué no antes o después? Algunos argumentan que esto refleja un despertar compartido de la mente humana, una línea cruzada cuando el lenguaje, la observación y el pensamiento simbólico se unieron. Otros perciben en ello el remanente de algo anterior, un don común disperso y recordado de forma diferente por cada cultura. Quizás no fue que Sumeria, Egipto y el Valle del Indo descubrieron la civilización por separado, sino que cada uno redescubrió fragmentos de un plano más antiguo. Los propios sumerios parecen creer que en sus himnos se describe a la primera ciudad, Eridu, como erigida de la arcilla de las profundidades, con cimientos más antiguos que el cielo. Se decía que el templo del dios Enki, el Apsu, se asentaba allí sobre las aguas de la sabiduría que fluían del inframundo. Metáfora, sí, pero también imagen de continuidad, conocimiento que emerge de las profundidades del tiempo. Incluso su mitología del sonido contiene ecos de orden científico. La palabra Enlil, a menudo traducida como Señor del Aire, también puede significar la vibración que se mueve por el espacio. En los cantos rituales, los sacerdotes lo invocaban como el aliento que moldea el mundo, la fuerza invisible que estructura la materia. Para los oídos modernos, suena extrañamente a una comprensión poética de la frecuencia y la resonancia, la física de la vibración escrita en lenguaje sagrado. Si estos paralelismos son coincidencia, son profundos. Y, sin embargo, coincidencia o no, la impresión persiste de que los primeros pueblos que conocemos no luchaban por el conocimiento, sino por recordarlo. Cada ecuación, cada templo, cada tablilla se siente como un eco, una onda sonora de algo más antiguo. Vivimos rodeados de los restos de sus sistemas. Cada vez que decimos la hora, cada vez que dividimos un círculo, cada vez que medimos, repetimos la lógica de su mundo. Siguen enseñándonos, aunque sus nombres se hayan desmoronado. Quizás la civilización no comience cuando inventamos el conocimiento. Quizás comience cuando lo redescubrimos, cuando el silencio del olvido se rompe y regresa un eco. Pero si Same recordaba lo que había sucedido antes, ¿qué desastre había borrado el mundo que intentaban reconstruir con tanto esmero? Si uno escucha lo suficiente, incluso la arcilla empieza a hablar, enterrada bajo siglos de viento y silencio. Las tablillas de Nippur y Nínive forman lo que podrían ser las bibliotecas más antiguas de la historia de la humanidad, colecciones de derecho, medicina, ciencia espacial y rituales. Sin embargo, son más que colecciones de conocimiento. Son la memoria congelada de un pueblo que parecía desesperado por conservar lo que sabía. Cuando estas tablillas se desenterraron por primera vez, rompieron con la idea de que los pueblos antiguos vivían en la ignorancia. En cambio, mostraron un mundo de escribas, expertos y pensadores que escribían como si estuvieran compitiendo contra la desaparición. La ciudad de Nippur no era una capital real. It had no king, no armies, no empire. And yet it was the spiritual heart of Sumer, home to the great temple of Enlil, the Lord of the Wind. Beneath its ruins, diggers uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, an ancient collection so huge that experts are still figuring out pieces today. What they found changed everything. There were business lists, yes, but also poems, star maps, surgery instructions, even thinking reflections on fate and justice. So many of these texts come before the Bible by more than 1,000 years, yet they contain thoughts so familiar that they feel almost modern. Imagine standing in one of those rooms, the air thick with the smell of baked clay. Rows upon rows of tablets lined the shelves, each one pressed with the angled marks of cuneiform, each one a voice kept. The scribes of Nippur were not mere record keepers. They were guardians of continuity. In their schools, young students learned not only to read and write, but to memorize entire lists of signs, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. Learning to write in Sumer was an initiation into a secret order, an act of devotion as much as intellect. The clay tablet was their sacred object, their bridge to the past. The huge range of subjects kept there is staggering. One tablet details a code of rules for doctors. Do not cause harm by your hand. Do not hold back the cure. Another describes the structure of the liver and the practice of fortune-telling, an early observation of anatomy written in ritual language. Others list mineral substances used in dyes and medicines. Even more surprising are the space records, the risings of stars, the movements of the moon, and the prediction of eclipses. For a people we call the first, their thinking horizon was already huge. When the great flood of history finally drowned Sumer's cities through war, wearing away, and time, Nippur's tablets survived because they were clay. Feet and burial kept them where papyrus and parchment would have turned to dust. And so, thousands of years later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam began to dig at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they stumbled upon something even greater. The library of Ashurbanipal, a king of Assyria. That library, though built more than 1,000 years after Nippur's golden age, was its heir. Within its walls, the Assyrian scribes had gathered and copied Sumerian and Babylonian texts, over 30,000 tablets in total. When the palace burned, the heat hardened them into permanence. The result was a collection of universal scope, keeping stories, calculations, and prayers that would otherwise have vanished forever. Among them were pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story that came before Genesis. There were omens, star lists, dream guides, hymns to Inanna and Enki, and lists of kings stretching back into myth. Reading those tablets now, one feels a strange mixture of thanks and sadness. Thanks that the fire saved them. Sadness that the people they recorded was already fading when the copies were made. The scribes of Nineveh worked like diggers of their own past, keeping texts they themselves could barely understand. When Colophon reads, from the old tablets, damaged, restored with care. Another tablet bears the quiet signature of a scribe. Ye have written what was left to me. Those words echo across the centuries like a sad song. They knew they were writing at the end of something. The content of these libraries hints at a thinking line that challenges simple sorting. In the Enuma Anu Enlil, thousands of lines devoted to heavenly omens, each movement of a planet, each ring around the moon was recorded and understood as a reflection of divine will. Behind the poetry, however, lies organized observation, data covering generations. The Sumerians and their heirs were scientists in priestly robes, mathematicians speaking in myth. They didn't separate the physical from the sacred. For them to measure the heavens was to talk with the gods. One of the most haunting discoveries in Nineveh's collection is the so-called Tablet of the Great Flood. It tells of a man chosen to survive the huge flood, commanded by a god to build a vessel and keep life. The parallels to Noah's story are unmistakable, but this version is older, perhaps the original. The flood, it says, swept over like a wind, erasing kings and cities alike. When the waters pulled back, kingship came down again from heaven. The cycle started again. The story is both myth and record, memory and metaphor. It is easy to read these texts as distant curiosities, but they were not written for us. They were written for continuity, for a future they hoped would still understand. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. The scribes must have known that empires fall and tongues vanish. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And perhaps they were right. Because so long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. Their numbers define our clocks. Their shape forms our buildings. Their myths live in our religions. Even their fears of flood, of forgetting remain ours. Every modern library is in a sense a descendant of Nippur and Nineveh. Each shelf a new layer of clay. But there is another layer to this story, one rarely spoken out loud. So many pieces from these ancient libraries describe devices, instruments, and processes that seem out of place in their time. One tablet speaks of a vessel of shining copper that stores the fire of heaven. Another mentions crystal that brings light to darkness. Experts understand these as metaphors for ritual objects. Yet one wonders, were they metaphors or faint echoes of lost technologies whose purposes we can no longer imagine? Even their writing system feels like a machine of keeping. Cuneiform could record both sound and idea, a mixed code that could survive translation. It was strong, adaptable, modular. When the Greeks later adopted the concept of the written collection, they did so under the shadow of Nineveh's example. The library as an idea began in Sumer. Standing before those tablets today under the clean light of museums, it is difficult not to feel the pull of that ancient purpose to remember. They knew knowledge could vanish. They saw it happen before. Perhaps that's why they wrote so focused, so completely. Every wedge in clay was an act of fighting against the flood. But if the Sumerians and their heirs were merely keeping what they already knew, what then had they lost? What deeper collection lies still buried beneath the layers of time, waiting for another people to find it, to read, to wonder, and to ask the same unanswerable question? In the oldest stories ever written, humanity is not born. It is made. The Sumerians told of gods who worked to shape the world and of a moment when they grew tired of their endless work. It was then they said that Enki, the god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the lady of life, gathered the spirit of the divine and mixed it with the clay of the earth. From this mixing came the first humans, Lulu Amelu, servants who could bear the burdens of creation. It is a tale half myth, half memory. Yet behind its poetry hides something more. An idea so ancient and so bold that it still unsettles us. That life itself may be the result of design. The Atrahasis epic carved into tablets long before the book of Genesis describes the goats meeting. Enlil, their leader, complains about the noise of the lesser beings who work in the fields. Enki offers a solution. They will fashion a new race to work in their place. But the raw clay alone is lifeless. To bring it alive, they need something of themselves. So they sacrifice a god. His blood mixed with the earth, his spirit divided among humankind. And thus through an act of divine rule-breaking, we are born both mortal and sacred, both servant and heir. It is an origin that feels older than any religion, part biology, part mystery. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Did they imagine this story as pure teaching story? Or were they recording something remembered from a time so far removed that it could only survive in mythic form? Diggers have long treated such tales as metaphors for the dawn of civilization, the moment when humanity learned farming, law, and writing. But what if the story's deeper meaning is word for word in ways we can no longer see? The phrase mixed with the blood of the gods appears again and again across Mesopotamian texts. In Akkadian texts like Enuma Elish, the genetic spirit of the divine was described as a life-bearing fluid, a seed of heaven. The same idea echoes in Egypt, in Greece, in the Hebrew Bible. The human body, they believed, carried pieces of something older, something heavenly. Modern readers tend to separate myth from science. Yet when one looks closely, the distance between them narrows. The Sumerians describe the process of creation that involves the handling of flesh and blood, matter filled with intention. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods try repeatedly, creating beings that fail, one blind, one mute, one unable to reproduce, until finally they succeed. The story reads like an ancient teaching story of trial and error, a poetic reflection of some forgotten knowledge of human body parts or heredity. Perhaps not word for word trying, but a symbol of that haunting gut feeling that life is the product of order, of design. Experts who studied the Sumerian collection note how often their texts speak of templates, the me, as blueprints for both physical and moral reality. Every element of existence from kingship to weaving to fertility was said to have its own me, a divine formula that kept the universe in balance. To have the me was to have the power of creation itself. When Inanna stole these tablets from Enki, chaos spread through the world, not because she went against the gods, but because she messed up the code that kept life going. The language of myth begins to sound almost like computers, as though the ancients saw reality as a system governed by hidden instructions. In another broken text, the god Enki tells his priest to guard the blood that makes the clay speak. That line, mysterious and strange, stays like an echo of biological truth. Blood indeed carries language of its own. DNA, the molecular code that decides life is formed. Could it be that what we read as divine metaphor once described an ancient understanding, one lost through time, not knowledge of molecules or genetics as we know them, but a gut-level awareness that life structure lives within blood, within pattern? Of course, such guessing unsettles historians. Yet, it is impossible to ignore the pattern. Peoples across the ancient world share the same imagery. The mixing of heaven and earth. The creation of man from divine matter. The Egyptians said humanity was formed from the tears of Are. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus shaping man from clay. The Hebrews echoed Sumer almost word for word. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nose the breath of life. The story moved, changed, survived, but its core remained. The mingling of dust and spirit, matter and code. What does it mean that the oldest written people begins with such a story? Perhaps it was simply a way to explain consciousness, to make peace with the human desire for purpose with the reality of hard work. Or perhaps it was a memory handed down through floods and ruins, a recollection of a time when beings older than us walked the earth. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. In later Babylonian texts, these gods were said to teach humanity, farming, space science, and metalworking. To others, they are mythic symbols. To some, they are the forgotten teachers of early history. In one hymn from Nippur, the poet writes, "Praise who mixed the spirit of heaven with the clay of the Abzu, who gave to men the image of the gods." The phrase image of the gods, Salmu Elani, carries the same sound as the later Hebrew Tselem Elohim. Could the Sumerian idea of divine image have been the original seed from which that later concept grew? The parallels are too exact to dismiss as coincidence. What we call religion may at its roots be the language of remembering. There is also the returning symbol of the tree, the sacred land linking heaven, earth, and the underworld. On many Sumerian seals, figures stand beside a style tree flanked by winged beings offering vessels of water or life. The picture repeats from Mesopotamia to Persia to Egypt, even to the Indus Valley. Some understand it as the tree of life, others as a genetic symbol, a symbol of family line. Either way, it represents continuity, a bridge between divine and mortal. Perhaps that is what the blood of the gods truly meant, a metaphor for consciousness itself, the spark that connects flesh to forever. And yet, there is sadness in this myth. For the same gods who created humanity also cursed them with death. To be made from divine blood was to contain divinity, but also to be forever cut off from it. The story of Enki's creation is one of both gift and exile. We are children of the divine and prisoners of matter. Every Sumerian prayer, every sad song carries that tone of wanting for return, for reunion, for remembering. If their myths were indeed memories, then perhaps they were mourning a separation that once happened, a fall not of sin, but of knowledge. Something was divided long ago, and ever since we have tried to piece it back together. Each age rediscovers pieces, the laws of physics, the secrets of life, and calls it progress. But maybe it is only recollection. In the end, the Sumerians saw no conflict between creation and science, between gods and clay. They saw only one story endlessly retold. The universe awakening to itself through the vessel of flesh. The blood of the gods flows in us still, they would have said, not as a myth, but as a reminder that our beginnings are both earthly and universal, both known and forgotten. If the first humans were born from the mingling of heaven and earth, what happens when the blood of the gods remembers what it once was? There is a strange quiet that follows disaster, a silence so complete that even memory hesitates to speak. The Sumerians knew that silence well. They called it the day the waters swept over the land. To them, it was not merely a storm or a flood. It was the eraser of a world, the cleansing of an age that had grown too loud, too full of its own creations. What remained after was not just ruin, but memory loss. Humanity began again, they said, smaller, humbly, haunted by echoes of what came before. In the Epic of Ziusidra, one of the earliest flood stories known to humankind, the story unfolds in pieces carved into clay sometime around 1700 BC, but rooted in far older spoken memory. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decide destruction. Only Ziusudra, a king and priest of the city of Shuruppak, receives a whisper of warning from the god Enki. Build a vessel, Enki tells him, of strong walls and sealed pitch. Take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain begins, not gentle but endless. The rivers rise, the sea swallows the plains, and the horizon dissolves into water. For 7 days and nights, the world vanishes beneath the flood. When the waters pull back, Ziusidra opens a window and releases a dove. It does not return. It knows the earth has appeared again. In thanks, he offers sacrifice. The gods moved or perhaps sorry grant him forever life and place him in the land beyond the rivers. This story comes before the biblical flood by over 1,000 years. Its bones are the same. Divine anger, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson, no blame. It reads instead like a geological memory, a record of an event so deep that it burned itself into the human timeline. Digging, careful as ever, hesitates to confirm such myths. And yet, beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, there is proof that something like the Sumerian flood did happen. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley dug at UR and discovered a deep empty layer of dirt, clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick sandwiched between layers of living spaces. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shuruppak. The dating matched roughly to 2900 BC. Woolley described it simply, a flood of such size that it destroyed life and left the land empty. The people who rebuilt afterward did so as if they were starting anew. To modern minds, it may sound like coincidence, one local disaster among many. But to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by rains and melting snows, may have combined with tidal surges from the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps the memory reaches even farther back to the violent end of the last ice age when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern continues. Myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to the Greek Deucalion, from the Aztec Coxcox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the shared mind. The Sumerians though described it not merely as disaster but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they pulled back. The connection between heaven and earth was cut. Humanity was left to remember and to misremember. Some tablets hint that the flood was not entirely natural. In one piece, the gods debate among themselves. Should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for destruction. Enki pleads for mercy, seeking another way. It is a talk of opposing forces, order and compassion, control and chaos. When the huge flood comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the Great Decree, suggests purpose. The flood was not just water, it was judgment. Others have seen in this story traces of something even more complicated, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood was not a word-for-word flood, but a symbolic description of an event that reset human culture. A comet impact, a shift in climate, a collapse of knowledge. Geological proof hints at sudden sea level rises and space impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To the survivors, it would have seemed divine punishment, unexplainable power. And so they remembered it as a cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every object the Sumerians later buried was a piece of that forgotten age. Their writing, their mathematics, their star charts. It feels like an attempt to get back something half-remembered. They were not inventing civilization. They were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery guides. The god Enki, savior of humanity, teaches the survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge in there. View was not discovery but putting back together. In the poem, The Return of Inanna, the goddess goes down to the underworld and rises again after 3 days, bringing fertility back to the land. The Sumerians may have seen the flood in similar terms, going down into chaos, return to life. Yet beneath the spiritual teaching story lingers a geological memory. Something happened, something huge enough to break both land and legend. There is a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like confession. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, what you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep. It is a strange sentence, one that suggests that divinity and humanity are not separate species, but states of memory. The flood did not just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it is said that the soil releases a faint metallic smell, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. In that smell lies the leftover of the ancient disaster, the flood that ended an era and began another. And perhaps the Sumerians sensed that such cycles never truly end. Every people, no matter how advanced, eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or forgetfulness. To the ancients, survival was not victory. It was responsibility. Shusudra was not rewarded with paradise, but exile, sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and keeping, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. That thread wound its way into every myth that followed, binding the ages together like layers of story. When the Sumerians wrote of the huge flood, they weren't warning us. They were reminding themselves that the gods or perhaps nature itself always demands silence after too much noise. And in that silence, humanity must learn again how to begin. If every age is washed away to make room for the next, then what will be the flood that erases us? And who will be left to remember what we once knew? Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in pieces scattered across the world. They called such leftovers shuba, meaning pieces of the whole. To them, these pieces were more than old objects. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. And as centuries passed, each new discovery dug up in the soil of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the mountains beyond seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Something had existed before them, something both huge and forgotten. When explorers first began digging up ancient sites across the Near East in the 1800s, they were not only finding cities, they were finding odd things, objects that did not belong to their assigned ages, technologies that seemed misplaced, objects whose beginnings no one could explain. In the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found gears carved into stone, lenses ground from quartz, and sculptures showing figures in complicated robes patterned with symbols that did not match any known writing system. Most of these finds were quietly removed to museum vaults, labeled as curiosities or mistakes. Yet a few, just a few, found their way into the books of digging, sparking debates that have never truly ended. In the 1930s, reports came out of a small egg-shaped object dug up near Baghdad made of terracotta and capped with a copper cylinder. It seemed to contain traces of acid wearing away. Some researchers proposed it could generate an electric charge, an early battery 2000 years older than it should have been. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a vessel of ritual or storage. But the possibility remains that the ancients may have known ways to control forces we only rediscovered thousands of years later. Even now, it sits behind glass in the Baghdad Museum, its function unclear, its silence heavier than explanation. There are other whispers in Turkish. Anatolian highlands, far from Sumer, a site called Göbekli Tepe reveals huge stone pillars carved with animals and space symbols more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years before Sumer's rise. The site comes before farming. Yet, its builders arranged stones weighing tons into shape enclosures lined up with the stars. No writing, no metal, no cities, yet an understanding of space science and engineering that seems out of place. Deikes call it the first temple. But to the Sumerians, who appeared long after, such a site would have been described another way, a leftover from before the flood. And in the caves of northern Iraq at Shanidar, skeletons have been found buried with flowers, proof of ritual, of consciousness, stretching back to the Neanderthals. The layers of humanity overlap here like layers of time, each one keeping a different kind of knowledge. The deeper the dig, the older the skill becomes. It is as if civilization did not climb a ladder but floated in waves rising, drowning, resurfacing. Among Sumerian experts, there has always stayed a theory unspoken but continuing that their civilization's sudden appearance was not sudden but received. Their myths say as much. After the flood, Enki gives to the survivors the black-headed people the tools of life, writing, measurement, farming, and law. It does not invent these things. It puts them back. The very language of Sumer hints at this putting back. Words for creation often come from roots meaning to reawaken or to rebuild. Theirs was a people of remembering, not beginning. Digging layers support this gut feeling. Beneath the oldest known cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk lie still older layers of living spaces washed by ancient dirt. Radiocarbon dates suggest settlements there more than 8,000 years old, coming before the so-called birth of civilization. In some layers, tools appear that should not exist. Advanced metalworking, fine pottery, building exactness. None of it fits neatly within the model of straight progress. Instead, it suggests a broken timeline, an early history erased, then half recovered. Every culture receives its ghosts. For the Sumerians, those ghosts were the gods themselves. The Anunnaki were not worshipped as distant gods, but remembered as teachers, those who had walked among humans before the flood. In hymns, they are called lords of wisdom, builders of cities, those who measured the dark waters. Some modern thinkers have tried to recast them as mythic symbols, mental symbols of knowledge. But in the cuneiform lines, the tone is different. These were recollections, not teaching stories. The Sumerians spoke of them with the language one uses for ancestors, not ideas. In one particularly haunting tablet from Nippur, the scribe records a vision. He saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. He saw lights beneath the sea that never fade. Experts translate it as metaphor. But its imagery echoes across mythologies, the sunken realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Sip-Dipi, the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event broken through the lenses of geography and time. Some earth scientists now suggest that such a flood did indeed happen around 12,000 years ago when ice melt caused huge sea level rise and sank vast coastlines. Entire cultures, if they existed there, would have been erased, leaving only memories passed down through survivors who rebuilt inland. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have been among them? Could their descendants have carried pieces of that vanished science into Sumer, Egypt, and beyond? The proof is circumstantial, but the pattern continues. Civilization appears not as invention, but as rediscovery. There are objects that seem to confirm this continuity, though most remain debated. In Iraq and Iran, diggers have found drill holes in diorite, one of the hardest stones on earth, smooth and exact, as though made by spinning tools. In Egypt, identical markings appear on granite and basalt. The same techniques, the same signatures, separated by thousands of miles. Coincidence perhaps, or memory and ancient technology surviving through pieces of craft. Even language carries traces of this gift. The Sumerian word tia means both life and rib. In their creation myth, woman is made from the rib of the first man, an image that later appears in Genesis. But tia also means to repair. Thus, woman is not a creation but a putting back together, a piece made whole again. The play of meanings reveals the deeper Sumerian view. Life itself is the process of repair, of remembering what was lost. The same principle seems to guide their temples and ziggurats. Each was built as a copy of a heavenly structure. A model of what already existed in the realm of the gods. To build for the Sumerians was to rebuild. Even the measurements of their temples were described as according to the plan written in the stars. It is a line both poetic and exact. For they believed the gods had left the blueprints of the world not on paper but in the sky. If we follow that idea further, it begins to sound less like religion and more like a scientific thinking. What if every discovery humanity makes is not creation but a remembering? Each age in its turn finds a piece, one piece of the greater whole, and believes it new. The Sumerians might have smiled at this illusion, for they saw time not as a straight line, but as a wheel. What was drowned will rise again. The flood did not erase everything. It buried the body of a lost world, but not its bones. Those bones, objects, stories, words still surface, carried by the slow current of time. The question is not whether that earlier world existed, but how much of it we are willing to recognize when we see it reflected in our own. If every piece points towards something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own people is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Every people leaves a trace of its voice. And yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, not connected to any other tongue. Language experts call Sumerian a language isolate. A term that sounds medical. But what it really means is this. It should not exist. Every known language from the ancient Akkadian to the tongues we speak today fits into a family tree. But Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed like its people and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. When experts first began to figure out cuneiform in the 1800s, they assumed all Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found writings whose grammar and structure went against logic. The verbs didn't they change like Akkadian ones? The word order was reversed. Words seemed to stick together and break apart without pattern. Eventually, they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Language experts have searched for relatives in every direction. The Caucasus, the Indus Valley, the Altaic steppes, even the lost languages of the Mediterranean. None effete. Every guess collapses under the weight of grammar. The language stands outside the great evolutionary web of speech, as if it had been transplanted, complete, alien, ancient. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables. It's a small code that changes the one before it. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning, folding time, number, and emotion into one gesture. For example, the word Amaheutinda means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix changes the view of relationship and space. It is a language that sees reality as flowing, interconnected, always shifting, more thinking than grammar. Even the word Imagur 15 meaning Sumerian tongue translates word for word as the true speech or the language of origin. It is as though the people themselves remembered their words as received, not invented. They called writing Emi, the voice made permanent. The concept itself is deep. To write was not to record. It was to keep vibration, to trap sound in matter. And perhaps that was why they pressed their words into clay instead of ink, because clay lasts, as if the earth itself were the keeper of their voice. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly, slow, heavy with breath, filled with stops and harmonies of air. When language experts attempt to speak it out loud, something strange happens. It feels at the same time ancient and new, like a music that does not belong to human mouths. Some have suggested that its structure copies the patterns of Sumerian thought itself, non-straight, relational, circular. The same qualities appear in their art and building. Balance, repetition, reflection. Everything in their world was connected through pattern. What unsettles experts most is how advanced this language system was from its first appearance. There is no proof of its growth from simpler forms. No Proto-Sumerian, no trial writings leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets dating from 3300 BC already use a standardized script steady across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of steadiness means not invention but transmission. Someone taught them how to write. Batu. The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisaba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. Sis always shown holding a stylus and a tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them writing was not only language but measurement, a way of carving universal order into human form. In that light, their language was sacred technology. Each sign a key to the structure of the universe. When Sumerian eventually faded from daily use around 2000 BC, it did not die. It became a language of the gods used only by priests, space scientists, and experts. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy objects. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called adobas, young scribes memorized long two-language lists. Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students working over a language no one spoke, repeating the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital lived in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words refuse direct match. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine home. Their differences blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian sound patterns to math ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns copies musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows shape sequences. It is as though language, sound, and number were once unified, a single system of connection that later peoples forgot how to read. The Babylonians turned it into astrology. The Greeks called it philosophy. The modern world calls it science. But the Sumerians had no divisions between them. Their language itself was the bridge. A few daring language experts on the edges of study have proposed that Sumerian might keep traces of a lost language family that existed before the flood. A proto-language from which all later tongues split. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure teaching story, but distant memory. The idea is tempting that once the world spoke in a single voice and Sumerian was its last echo. When one listens to the rebuilt readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than like calls, mathematical prayers to line up the human spirit with the pulse of the universe. The word spoken is the world made. When writing reads, in their eyes, language did not describe reality. It created it. If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its being alone rather than proving uniqueness may instead reveal age. It is a frozen tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words broke into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its disappearance was long. For those 1,000 years, no one alive could read it. Yet when the first modern experts began to figure out its signs in the 1800s, they felt something strange, a sense of already seen, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakened something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is. The dream language of humanity. A leftover of our first speaking, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist. And yet it does. Quietly going against the logic of history. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then whose voice were the Sumerians remembering when they learned to speak? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase comes up again and again. Anunnaki. Those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and rethought for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not unclear gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of huge power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are written beside the earliest star charts, their symbols buried in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later people softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There they are described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns, their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds, more assorting than account. They live in the heavens, yet come down to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, lives in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Abzu beneath the earth. Between them moves a group that feels less like a family of gods and more like a council of managers, each assigned a domain, each responsible for keeping the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so puzzling is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were respected, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are shown as powerful but not all-knowing, mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind. They interact with it. They guide, teach, and at times punish. Some of the oldest writings, such as those from the city of Lagash, show these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that look like wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, teaching them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of guessing. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a word-for-word truth. That the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose beginnings lay beyond the earth. The theory is debated, of course. Secharia Sitchin in the 20th century would make the Anunnaki famous again by understanding their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu not just as Ska, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians received knowledge of space science, metalworking, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a mixed creation. Most experts rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet, even among the critics, the question stayed, why did the Sumerians of all people know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Ki, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a space body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the language fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind that crossing was divine movement, the coming down of the watchers. But even if we strip away modern guessing, something unusual remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Elu, the divine watcher who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered religion. The watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity in their eyes was a trial worth keeping in record. One hymn from UR calls them those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that comes down with them lighting the earth. Experts translate these passages symbolically as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, coming down, and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word Jira translated as divine flame was also used to mean metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The play between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not word-for-word visitors, but the showing of universal order. The planets themselves, the forces of nature given personality. Enki, Lord of the Deep, copies the watery abyss. Enlil, Lord of Air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave family trees, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have left. The houses are silent. Their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic. It is historical, almost documentary. It is the sadness of a people remembering the pulling back of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings made into myth over time, their deeds made bigger into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost people, lifted by respect into godhood. But there is another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who came down to teach humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Netjeru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the devas coming down from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna who came from the stars to teach writing in time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern. Beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event broken through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say kingship came down once more from the heavens. But the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both. For the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the Watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns or the reflections of those who promised to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Peoples remembered and misremembered the bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the holy mound, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Sigurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language and perhaps even history broke. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity speaking one tongue sought to build a tower that may reach unto heaven. But the Lord confused their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It is a story of divine punishment for human pride. Yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens. A ziggurat whose top was said to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities left empty, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different color. Black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun. It was not merely a temple. It was a map of the universe, a stairway of connection between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BC, he carved upon its walls, "I raised the summit to the heavens so that its top might rival the heavens themselves." But even he, King of Kings, knew the weakness of that ambition, for every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before, eaten by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew that no structure could put back what was lost, the direct talking between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken. And yet, humanity could not stop building. Perhaps we were not going against the heavens. Perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priests of Babylon repeated the tale of Babel, they did so not as a warning, but as sad song. The confusion of languages was not punishment. It was tragedy. Once they said, all words were one, as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the breaking of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Diggers digging the site of ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air. And if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there, a mountain of clay. And fire pointing toward the sky that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than building. It is symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of coming down, not going up. A structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up. But not in the human sense. It was the gods who came down, the watchers who crossed the line between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that coming down and the later story of Babel, the meaning flipped. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping. And when we reach too high, silence answered. It is a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like showings of that same ancient break. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since then has been in a way a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion. But perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. The single language of the gods, once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each piece grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. The unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still within each language, echoes of the first remain. The same basic words for sky, for water, for breath, the same rhythm in prayer and poetry, the same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. Their god Enki, the trickster and savior of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him giving many tongues upon the nations so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower lasts, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio towers that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, pieces of that longing still remain. Travelers have described hearing strange sounds in the ziggurat space, an echo that makes even a whisper bigger. It is as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility. But perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it is simply a record of loss. The moment when knowledge turned to language and language began to fail. The divine pulled back, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this. Every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it. With each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable, the tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint whisper of the single language, still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, when the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities. Below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They pulled back into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon and later of Chaldea became the caretakers of what remained, the pieces of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark hallways, the scribes and priest-space scientists performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for thousands of years. The watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens. But their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant talking, now it meant keeping. The universe no longer spoke clearly. The priests understood its silence through symbols. Each sign on a tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon were not merely houses of worship. They were labs of continuity. In the Asagila, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They listed eclipses, storms, and signs, writing them into thousands of tablets. It is from these records that the later science of space science and even astrology was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older belief that the sky was not a machine but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests called Baru and Ashipu were trained not merely in ritual but in mathematics, medicine and prayer. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred shape of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge was not split up. It was total. A single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, later made fun of as superstition, carried traces of skilled understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in ash-shaped patterns that copy the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties are now known to purify air. They used bronze bowls carved with math formulas that when struck produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony was not mere theater. It was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of the temple priests, but cared little for their belief systems. The sacred texts were copied, retouched, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, written in myth. What could not be kept was changed, transferred into story. Thus the old sciences survived disguised as legends waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's sad song for this age of hiding. When peace from the Chaldean oracles reads, the word has been divided. The code has been sealed. Only the initiated may open the gate. The gate in their symbolism was not a door but a line of understanding, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that line required both thinking and purity, logic and respect. Knowledge, they believed, could not be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In the later centuries, Greek travelers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it is said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans taught that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the shape of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The code of Sumer, hidden through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. So many pieces of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light said to be used by the gods to carve the laws of the universe. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss these as poetry, but the priests meant something word for word. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance, and in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Varu, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling word order, using metaphors that only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names. Mul for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders, the language was myth. To those who knew it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, he ordered the translation of all temple collections into Greek. Most were misunderstood. Many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests pulled back into Persia, Syria, and eventually into being unknown. By the Primera Century BC, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem. Others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system lasted. Astrology, often made fun of as superstition, is the faint reflection of their space mathematics. The shape of sacred building from the pyramids to cathedrals carries their ratios. Even our words magic, matrix, measure came from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculation became over time the grammar of civilization itself. But there is a certain sadness in this survival. For the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge once broken from its sacred context loses part of its soul. The formulas survive but the meaning fades. The rituals remain but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes late at night when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence. Watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold machine, but a living manuscript written by a hand both human and divine. We have figured out their code but forgotten their respect. We have learned the symbols but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now? When the code lies open, but the world has forgotten what it was written for? History, they say, is written by the victors. But before it is written, it is rewritten, and perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks and later the Romans did not merely conquer the ancient world. They reorganized its memory. They took the scattered pieces of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices and rebuilt them into a story that began conveniently with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history. And in that transformation, time itself was changed. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The last priest-based scientists of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The Tankeres found not gods but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, practical and curious, collected them, though they could not yet read them. What they did instead was something more subtle. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the pieces of space science, and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenic space science. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first people became a prelude, a footnote, an echo. But buried beneath that act of taking lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priests of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their belief system to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children. You have no old men among you." It meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were receivers of pieces they barely understood. And yet through translation, through adaptation, they claimed ownership. It is here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was circular. The Sumerians saw eras as tides eternally returning. Creation, flood, putting back, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages Septepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sar. Each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept. Stratime. A line that begins and ends, moving always forward. Progress, invention, destiny. Ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror. And thus, the empire rewrote not only history, but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became teaching stories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To keep order, the conquerors made official a beginning, an origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became before history. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay collections dissolved into fable. This rewriting was not merely political. It was spiritual. The Roman Church, receiving Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later made official a straight record of divine creation and human salvation. The circular universe became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was called heresy, myth, or sin. And yet, pieces of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived, disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat continued, reimagined as the biblical Babel. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn. It resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, experts began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts mentioning Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath thousands of years of sediment. For nearly 2000 years, the first people remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It was not until the 1800s, when British and French diggers began to dig up Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were dug up at Ur and Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward, not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the Empedus record began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued, only now in more subtle form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had as forerunner not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, early space scientists. Their gods were made into myths, their mathematics made simple. The old worldview, a universe alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The Empedus logic of straightness remained intact. We received not the Sumerians' sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of peoples, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered record as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future. And yet the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years marks our sense of record. Their myths of circular floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half figured out, resists final translation, as if guarding secrets too old for our straight minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's digging. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world. We all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we are no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears. Or they're built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows. And beneath those layers, faint but continuing, the memory of Sumer lasts. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time in its own quiet way rewrites empires. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors, who declared themselves the beginning, are now objects in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as early, still lasts. The tablets outlasted marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust. We were here first. If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who in the end will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow across 5,000 years, it found its way back into the light. Translated, digitized, shown in glowing pixels on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and code, two forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their shape of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were dug up in the 1800s, they appeared still, mere curiosities of digging. But as experts began to figure them out, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories, inventories, algorithms of trade, space tables, and even if-then conditionals carved in clay. One tablet from Nippur reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record shape series, square roots, and number systems so advanced that they would not be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory. The stylus was instruction. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern collection, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that lasts beyond its maker began there. Yet what they kept was not merely information, but purpose. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire would not destroy them. Water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time something, anything, would survive. In the cold light of museums, those tablets appear ancient. But when their contents are written into digital text, they read with startling modernity. Lists of professions, wages, contracts, codes of rules, equations, maps of the stars. The Sumerians lived in systems, networks of exchange and observation. And when one looks at them closely, the lines between their world and ours begin to blur. The ziggurat becomes a server farm. The scratch stylus becomes a keyboard. The same impulse drives both. The desire to record, to calculate, to build meaning from pattern. But there is a deeper resonance, one that hums beneath the surface of all technology. In Sumerian mythology, creation itself was described as writing. The god Enki carved the laws of existence onto the tablets of destiny. These tablets decided the fates of men, the movements of stars, even the rise and fall of kings. Whoever had them could rewrite reality. The myth may sound remote, but its logic is familiar. We too live in a world where code governs existence, where lines of digital instruction decide life, commerce, and war. Our machines are the new tablets of destiny. Our programmers the modern scribes. The medium has changed, but the principle remains. Those who control the code shape the world. It is tempting to believe that progress separates us from the ancients. But what if it only circles back? The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform repeated across thousands of years may be the earliest expression of binary logic on or off, presence or absence, impression or void. Each mark was an encoded decision, a unit of meaning stored within a grid. The tablets are not objects of the early past. They are prototypes of the digital mind. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again. A feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old, the reappearance of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisaba, goddess of writing and calculation. Lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet, the numbers of the stars are your servants. Toher, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every data set, every machine translation is a ritual of calling, a plea to the algorithms that now hold our shared memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It is worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces able to bind or free. Even the dead could be reached through writing. Some tablets were buried with the departed, messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one writing reads, know that we too sought the truth of heaven. That message pressed into clay 5,000 years ago might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hum with the same longing to keep, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation. But perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Reversed, the heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the respect those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to last. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for forever. We have learned to keep everything except the quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? History is a fragile thing, and yet it lasts in the most unexpected places, in the grooves of stone, in the rhythm of myth, in the faint tremor of a name whispered through time. Peoples rise and collapse. Empires rewrite the story. Yet some memories refuse to die. They float beneath the surface, sleeping, but alive, waiting for the world to remember again. The story of Sumer is one such memory, a pulse that continues to beat beneath the skin of our modern world. Quiet but insistent, like the echo of something that never truly left. When the first Sumerian tablets were translated, they were treated as curiosities, their religion dismissed, their kings reduced to myth. But over time, a pattern began to appear. A sense that these pieces were not simply ancient texts, but the opening chapters of the human mind. The Sumerians were not a lost people. They were the memory of civilization itself. Everything that came after law, space science, building, language, measurement, was already contained within their clay. We have merely been rewriting their story in new alphabets. Even now, their traces linger in the most ordinary corners of life. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, the base 60 of Sumer ticks onward. Every map of the stars still follows the constellations they charted, the zodiac, the calendar, the shape of the circle. These are not Greek inventions but Sumerian gifts. We live by their mathematics, dream in their belief system, and speak through metaphors they first carved. The clay may have hardened, but the memory moves. And yet, it is not just the inventions that survive. It is the worldview behind them. The Sumerians believed that all creation was bound by relationship, that heaven and earth, matter and spirit were part of the same breath. The divine was not distant but interwoven with the physical. To build a temple was to echo the universe. To write a word was to copy the act of creation. In their myths, even the gods were subject to laws of balance and give and take. They did not rule as tyrants but participated in a living order. That idea, though buried beneath thousands of years of religion and empire, has never truly vanished. It resurfaces whenever humanity rediscovers the unity of science and spirit. Whenever we sense that knowledge without respect is incomplete. There is something haunting about the way the Sumerians saw time. They did not measure it as a straight line moving from past to future. They felt it as a cycle of remembering and renewal. The flood was not an ending but a turning. The loss of knowledge was never permanent. Every age they believed would rediscover the wisdom of the one before. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian legacy keeps returning through digging, through language, through myth, refusing to remain buried. The cycle turns again. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read, not by priests or scribes, but by digital collectors and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. We are, in a strange sense, continuing their work. The tablets have become servers. The gods of the Abzu, the deep, have become the networks that pulse beneath our oceans. The old metaphors have found new machines. But something of the Sumerian spirit still lingers in our technological faith. Like them, we build collections to outlast us. Like them, we write in hope of surviving the flood. Ours no longer of water, but of data and forgetting. Every digital message, every line of code, every photograph kept on invisible clouds is a modern cuneiform, a mark against disappearing. And perhaps deep down we share the same fear that one day silence will return and only the language of the machines will remember us. In their time the Sumerians feared that their gods would pull back, that the connection between heaven and earth would fade. Today we fear the opposite. That our own creations will outlive us and that what we have made will speak a language we no longer understand. Yet both fears spring from the same source. The awareness that memory has a life of its own. Once written, it cannot be unmade. The words outlast the writer. The record outlives the soul. Somewhere perhaps that is what the Sumerians intended. Their myths end not with triumph but with continuity, with the sense that even when the gods depart, their traces remain in the dust in the rivers in the eyes of those who still look upward. The gods have gone, one late Babylonian scribe wrote, but their breath still moves in the air. That breath is memory itself, unseen, unseen. Diggers continue to uncover new tablets every year. Some may hold contracts, others hymns, others pieces of stories that seem strangely modern. One tablet speaks of a man who loses his purpose in a world of excess. Another of a woman who goes against divine decree to speak her truth. Their emotions are ours. Their longing is ours. The more we translate, the more the distance collapses. We realize that 5,000 years are not a gap, but a circle returning to its beginning. There are nights when the desert still reveals its secrets. After storms, the wind shifts the sand and a piece of clay surfaces. Another piece of the story rejoining the light. To touch such a piece is to touch both the beginning and the end of history. Its markings, once a code of empire, now look like the patterns of microchips and circuits. The similarity feels accidental, yet something within it whispers otherwise. Perhaps the universe repeats its designs, sculpting the same logic in clay and in silicon, in hands and in algorithms. The Sumerians believed that the world was born from the mingling of memory and matter, the Abzu, the deep waters giving rise to form. And so it seems fitting that their story should end as it began, not in silence, but in return. Their cities are gone, their names forgotten by most, but their breath moves still in the languages we speak, the numbers we count, the stars we map, and the stories we tell. Maybe that is the secret they left hidden beneath the dust. That no people ever truly dies. It only transforms, passing its soul forward in symbols, waiting to be reawakened. The clay of Sumer became the circuitry of our age, and through it the old gods still whisper, no longer from temples, but from the quiet hum of data centers, from the pulse of screens in the dark, from the endless stream of words that cross the world each night. The memory has learned to survive every flood. It will survive this one, though. And when our towers crumble, when our languages fade, when our machines fall silent, perhaps someone or something will dig through the ruins of our world, find our tablets, and begin to read. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembering.